he got away with whatever he wanted to.
Got away with murder.
Got away with a lot. Roger fires 4 blasts from his shotgun. Some of them go through the windscreens. Some of them go into the tyres. Car takes off down Anzac Parade. This is 10:30 on a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
They would say, oh, look, we know that, say, Neil did the armed robbery, but we're a bit shy on some evidence. We'll just give it a helping hand. The bank manager bravely chases Weston. Weston turns around and shoots him dead. With Weston's death, conveniently for Roger,
Trail's left.
Trail is dead. He said men died because of what Roger did. He would not have been out on bail if not for Roger. So no matter how much Ned tried to dress it up that she'd enjoyed it,
It was a violent gang rape.
The I Catch Killers podcast was a fresh start for me, as I left policing behind and started a new life. Over the years, we've laughed together, cried, and shared some powerful moments.
Welcome to I Catch Killers. Welcome to another episode of I Catch Killers. The world of crime is a murky place, but when crooked cops join forces with criminals, politicians, and judicial officers, things can get out of hand. That's what happened in a particular shameful time in New South Wales history. We're talking here about the 70s and 80s in Sydney, where money, drugs and violence corrupted our streets. Today, we're going to get an extraordinary insight into the world through award-winning journalist Neil Mercer. He's going to give us a definitive inside story in the world of Neddy Smith and Roger Rogerson, which he also wrote about in his new book, The Kingpin and the Crooked Cop. Rogerson was at one stage a well-respected cop. Neddy was a gangster and a rapist, but they were also partners in crime, murderers and drug traffickers. They both died in jail. Today we're going to look at their lives, the corrupt world they operated in, and the damage they caused. You'll be shocked by what we've got to say. Neil Mercer, welcome to I Catch Killers.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
Well, I have been a cop, well, was a cop for a long time, and obviously I knew of Roger Rogerson and Neddy Smith and all the corruption in the world that they lived in. And I thought I knew most of it, but I've been reading your book, The Kingpin and the Crooked Cop, and I've got to say, the depth of it is quite remarkable. They were so brazen.
Well, thank you for that. But yeah, you're right. They were so brazen. And, when I started researching it, I thought I pretty much knew Roger's story, but then I delved deeper and deeper, particularly going back into the 70s. And there was stuff that just, I was amazed at some of the things that came out and the Roger's manipulation of the system, of his fellow cops, of judges, of courts, of all that sort of thing. And also his amazingly close relationship with Ned. I mean, you listen to some of the intercepted phone calls from, say, the early 80s, and it's like Ned and he are in the armed hold-up squad together or, in the cops together. Yeah, it's extraordinary.
They're literally partners in crime.
They were. I mean, just talking about those intercepted phone calls, I think they were 1983, the AFP, the Federal Police, had taps on Ned's phone. And Ned's phoning Darlinghurst Police Station, where Roger is then stationed, and he's saying, I've got 500 gold coins. Can you find out if they've been nicked? And Roger says, no problem. He goes away, he calls the property officer or whatever it is, and subsequent conversation with Ned, no, there's no record of these coins being stolen. And so, Ned's trying to figure out how he can fence these 500 gold coins, and he's enlisting Roger's help to make sure that, maybe they can't be traced and all that sort of stuff. And, another phone call, same time, there's Ned on the phone to Roger and another detective. Do you want me to bring the 10? Do you want me to bring the 10? We can whack it up 3 ways. And the cops obviously going, oh, no, don't sort of say that over the phone, mate, And it doesn't need much imagination, Gary, to know what Ned's talking about. Bring the 10 and whack it up 3 ways. He's talking about 10 grand.
It's always funny when you're listening to people on phone intercepts and whether it's cops, crooks or whoever, and everyone's assuming the phone's off, so they just tend to talk a bit quieter.
I love it when they say, look, we can't talk over the phone, but blah, 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 blah. And they go on and on and on. But I don't want to say too much over the phone. And then they do exactly that.
Yeah.
But, one of the interesting things about those telephone intercepts, this is 1983, nothing happened. Roger was not disciplined. The New South Wales police hierarchy was told about them and did well, bugger all.
That's what I found remarkable, how brazen it is. But just breaking down first that relationship between Roger and Ned, and I'm talking here in the general sense. I was taught when I came into policing, and it was certainly tightened, the relationship between detectives and informants. And when I was a young cop, it was nothing, what are you doing? I'm going to go see an informant at the pub. And you'd go out with an older detective and you'd meet some colourful character, and you'd sit there and have a couple of beers and information. It was so loose. It really was loose. It was virtually, you put in your duty book, seeing an informant, you didn't have to put the name, you didn't have to say what it was about, and that was the level of accountability. Thankfully, that has changed to the point where if you have any communication with a registered source, you need to document the full nature of the conversation, the person, the time, the location, that type of thing. We needed that, didn't we? It was obvious.
Most certainly needed that, and I think it's probably that tightening up is probably due in part to the relationship between Roger and Ned, because it's exactly that. Roger would disappear from the armed hold-up squad. Nobody knew where he was. He was off seeing an informant. Well, it could have been anybody. It was often Ned. There were lunches. There were more than a few beers. And I guess his superiors thought that was all okay because that's the way it had always been done. Yeah. But this relationship with Ned became much closer and closer and closer until, I wouldn't say they were great friends, but they were close, and it was you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, and money changed hands, and there was no supervision of that police officer informant relationship. I mean, he got away with whatever he wanted to.
Well, got away with murder.
Got away with a lot.
The other thing about the relationships with informants, and this is something that was drummed into me, and I hopefully pass that on to others, that the flow of information is one way. And it's difficult because I've had a lot of informants in my career, and they can be charismatic people, and you've really got to hold tight on your moral compass and make sure the exchange of information goes one way. They give you information, you're not feeding them information, but it looks like all those barriers were blurred in the relationship between Ned and Roger.
I think that's right. I mean, and I understand that problem. I understand why cops would have that difficult thing, because the informant wants something in return. They're not doing it for altruistic reasons. They want maybe, a financial reward, or you know this better than me. But Roger, well, he always maintained, he's no longer with us obviously, but he always maintained that Ned was his informant, one of his best informants. But it's clear that money was changing hands. And just as I said with the 500 gold coins, I think Ned's words were, I've got something we can make an earn on. Yeah. And I mean,
it's not...
that's pretty blatant. Make an earn on. What does that mean? Well, make a quid. 500 gold coins. Let's see if we can get rid of them somewhere.
And I think it was there was a passage in there, divvy it up three ways or whatever.
Oh, yeah. And that I think that was a separate thing, that money was to be paid by Ned to Roger and another detective on behalf of another reasonably minor criminal, Harvey Jones. Yeah. And, shall I bring the 10? We can whack it up three ways. And there are other conversations where they'd go, they'd been out for drinks the night before. And you're alluding to this where, you do take informants to the pub and you do have a couple of beers. But there were some intercepted phone calls where Ned's saying, I drank you under the table last night, mate. Oh, no, I did you like a dinner. And Ned says, I'll give you that 400 that I borrowed off you to the detective. And the detective, and then Ned, and they say, I'll no rush. You can bring the 400 whenever. And Ned says something like, it makes a bit of a change, doesn't it? You're usually taking it off me. I mean, it is so, they're usually taking money off Ned, or protecting him for whatever he'd done or was accused of doing. It was blatant, and I guess it wasn't just Roger, but I think Roger was the epitome.
Yeah, he was the poster boy of it.
He was the poster boy, and you look at him, and he was at one stage such a good detective in homicide, or the forerunner of homicide, and then in the armed hold-up squad. But he seriously, as we all now know, ran very much off the rails.
I suppose when we're talking about those type of conversations that were captured on listening devices or telephone intercepts, it's not with the benefit of hindsight we're putting the puzzles together. It's fairly obvious what was going on, but there didn't seem to be an appetite for it. Before we really break down the rise, the crimes and the fall of both Roger and Neddy, let's find out a little bit about you. So, Neil, I know you've been around a long time, like I have. And
I've been around, I guess, look, I started my journalistic career in 1972, which makes me officially a dinosaur, but I didn't really start reporting on crime until around 1981, and that my first experience was the shooting of Warren Lanfranchi.
Okay.
Prior to that, I'd done... worked in the old Parliament House in Canberra, covered the Sydney City Council, so I hadn't done any crime reporting, and I fell into it pretty much accidentally and not by design. And I went round when Lanfranchi was shot in 1981 by Roger in the laneway. A week or so later, I went round to see Warren Lanfranchi's dad, Keith, and interviewed him, and that was the first time I'd ever done a crime story, really.
Okay.
So,
well, you jumped in the deep end.
As I later discovered, I'd got in at as you say, at the deep end, because a year or so after that, I interviewed Roger for the very first time. That was 1982. Yeah. And then I started interviewing people around King's Cross and getting to know, in later years, Abe Saffron. And so, I came in completely unknowing at a level that I just did not understand in 1981, 82. I had no idea what I was getting into.
Well, it comes out in the book that you understood that environment, and I have an idea of the environment, having been a police officer, and you get what it was about, and the little nuances and just the way things work. Let's have you describe Roger Rogerson for us. How would you describe him as a person?
The very first day I met Roger, it was just up from Darlinghurst Police Station, and it was the first interview he'd done on the record since he shot Lanfranchi the year before. We went to a coffee shop in Oxford Street, just near Taylor Square in Sydney, and all I remember, or the thing I remember the most, is he had these piercing blue eyes, and I'm scribbling notes, so I'm looking down a lot, but every time I looked up, he was just staring at me. Yeah. And intently. That's what I remember about Roger. I wrote the story for the Herald. He phoned me the next day. He liked it because I'd been fair. He said, "You've given me a fair go. If there's anything I can ever do to help, give me a call." He was good company. He enjoyed a beer. He had a terrific memory. He knew so many crooks and other people. He could be charming. He'd walk little old ladies across the road. He'd help out neighbours cleaning their gutters. I mean, he's this fascinating personality because there's all the good things he did, but at the same time we know he had that cold, calculating, manipulative streak. I didn't really see a lot of that, but it became evident in later years when he was charged with the attempted murder of Michael Drury. Yeah. But Roger was... if you met him in the pub, he'd be terrific company. If you introduced him to friends, he'd be, "Hello, how are you going? Good to meet you. What do you do?" He'd be interested in people. He was an enigma, I think, in a lot of ways.
Certainly a complex character, because I know a lot of people, worked with a lot of people that worked with Roger, and he has... There's a consistency that comes through, that he was always charming, he was charismatic, he was a big personality, he was fun to be with. But looking at what we know about Roger now, it's almost like you're looking at that. Is that just part of his facade to manipulate people and control people?
Look, it could be. It's hard to know. I guess you'd have to be a psychiatrist or a psychologist to start figuring that out. And some people say, he was a psychopath or a sociopath. That's not my bag. But look, I think people went into court to give character evidence for him. He did things for neighbours and so on without being asked. Whether it's part of a facade, but he was doing those things long before he gets into trouble.
Yeah.
I've struggled to work him out. What I did find is that the more I looked, the more it seemed to be he had this ability to manipulate people. And I've asked myself, was I manipulated, as a reporter? I don't think so. I always knew who Roger was because I came in at that level of the Lanfranchi shooting when the Lanfranchi family said, Roger's murdered him. Keith said, he's murdered my son. So I was never under any illusions about Roger. But he, whether it was part of the facade, look, I don't know that we'll ever know. He was, as you say, a born leader, courageous, all that stuff. And I think in the end, Gary, I think it was really ego and power that drove him. I'm not even sure he was driven by money. Yeah. I think he was driven by the fact that I know Lenny McPherson, I've got him as an informant, I've got this informant, I know everybody in the underworld.
The classic prince of the city.
He's the prince of the city, That's right. And his superiors, some of whom he's worked with closely as a junior, by now a lot of them are way up high in the CIB. And he's a golden boy, and they overlook, I'm assuming, a lot of his foibles. But prince of the city, he was.
It's remarkable the influence he had as a detective sergeant. My career started just as his career finished, but I was in the armed hold-up squad probably 5 years after he finished. I remember being in the witness box, and this is the line of questioning. I'm a young, fresh-faced detective in the witness box. So you're in the stick-ups, are you? Yes. So you load people, you verbal people, you bash people, all of which I say no. You're the tough guys, aren't you? And Roger Rogerson's your hero, isn't he? I've been asked questions about Roger Rogerson in the witness box about a matter that's got nothing to do with him 5 years after he's left. And that's that power, that informal power that he had, the influence.
He did. He certainly had influence way beyond his rank of detective sergeant.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a senior investigator, but, he had influence with the head of the CIB, up to assistant commissioners, if not commissioner level, because they all knew him and they knew he was very effective. Roger, I guess, was the poster boy, as you said, for that hard-nosed, frontline detective in the armed hold-up squad in the 70s and 80s. Having said that, I think we do need to remember, and I'm not diminishing his faults or what he did wrong, the 60s and 70s in particular, there were a lot of armed robberies. There were a lot of very bad men or desperate men running around with shotguns, sticking those guns in the faces of young bank tellers and sometimes shooting them. And the modus operandi, it seems to me, looking back now, of the armed hold-up squad was to meet force with force. And that's evident in a couple of the shootings that Roger was part of. The suspected armed robbers were surrounded with overwhelming force.
Yeah.
And
I'm glad you mentioned that, Neil, because I try to explain it to people now because it's almost like a time gone by. But when I was a young detective in the 80s, armed hold-ups were particularly violent. They were frequent. It was a day wouldn't go by where a bank wasn't robbed or an armour guard van hit. And people would come in with shotguns and people would let those shotguns off and shoot innocent people. And the trauma that was passed on to the people that witnessed it was extreme. It was force meeting force, like in the armed hold-up squad, not condoning. And this is where policing can be tricky, that you got to hold a strong moral compass. Yeah, you can play hard, but if you slip that little bit, then it starts it's that slippery slope, hopefully not to the extent of Roger. But it was a different time and different rules, and it wasn't just the police. The courts, we could have unsworn statements in the dock. I look back at that and think how ludicrous that two detectives could go into a room with a suspect and come out and say he refused to sign the interview, but this is what he said, and give evidence in court. And a lot of times that evidence was accepted.
It was accepted pretty much all the time by judges, magistrates in Sydney, in New South Wales, and I suspect around Australia in a particular era, and police, and you would know this from talking to the old detectives, they would say, oh, look, we know that, say, Neil did the armed robbery, but we're a bit shy on some evidence. We'll just give it a helping hand by saying he did a record of interview that's unsigned. Well, the record of interview was typed up by the detectives, and I've read a lot of those, and some of them are, oh, look, I shouldn't say they're humorous, but after a while, and you read a lot of them unsigned, where the crim, and this is a hardened crim, is found in his bedroom early in the morning allegedly with some money, although only about 1,000 out of the 15,000 that he nicked. And he says something like, "Oh, well, now that you've found the money, what can I say? I was in it. You got me."
Now,
and this is a bloke that's been...
It wasn't really creative writing, was it?
No, it wasn't. I mean...
you're too good for me, Detective Sergeant
that's right.
Rogerson.
I was in it, but I didn't fire the shots.
Yeah.
And this is literally the words that are coming out.
I'll tell you, but I'm not signing the statement.
Yeah, I'm happy to tell you everything, but I will not sign, because that's the code by which I have lived. I mean, really? And as you say, Gary, the cops get all the blame for this, and okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
But there was a whole system of solicitors, barristers, magistrates and judges who went along with it.
Exactly, and they're smart people. They could have seen through what was going on, and it's again, and I tread a careful path here because we can't condone it.
No,
what's happened, but police are the ones that the finger gets pointed at, and that's fair. You know, they get the kudos if they do good work, and they're the ones that cop it when it's bad. So, yeah, it was an interesting time, and I just want to put on record here, because I'm sitting here and we're going to talk about corruption in the police force in a deep dive, and people might go, well, what a hypocrite you are, Gary. You're sitting here. Why are you sitting here? Because I was charged with an offence. I just want to say, recording a conversation on a telephone that I'm having with a suspect in a child murder is, nothing I'm ashamed of. So I just want to put that up front, Neil. I don't want to sit here like...
No, I think you're dead right. And I think the New South Wales Police Force, in having ignored a lot of the stuff that Rogerson and others did, I think the New South Wales Police Force has now got a reputation of sometimes eating its own. I call it eating their own.
Yeah.
They turn on people for things that should be like, oh, okay, you've made a mistake, but you've got 30 years service up. You've made a mistake, and I'm not suggesting you did, but too often it's like, oh, out, you're out. You know, a ton of bricks comes down on, a detective sergeant or somebody, and it seems to me it's completely unnecessary. So yeah, I think it's sometimes they overreact. And people bear the brunt of it.
Look, and I think we focus on the important things, and we won't get sidetracked, but the recent media talk about the Commissioner having bottles of gin. Like, what? Have we got something better to focus on? Like, really? Like, at a Commissioner, do you think that she would be concerned about who gets bottles of gin? Like, it's something that's been around for a long time. I just think that
that to me is crazy, and I don't know what people have got against the Commissioner. I think, she's made some mistakes, but the bottle of gin, I think that was her predecessor that started that. And when I heard that, Gary, I think I was reading something about Roger. It might have been the attempted murder of Michael Drury, and I'm going, a bottle of gin. Is this what we've come to? I mean, seriously, this is not corruption. Well, I don't think it is. It's silly. It's silly.
It's silly, and the fact that the focus is on that. And I'm thinking, what has this world come to?
I know.
but anyway, we digress. Neddy, tell us about Neddy. What do we know about Neddy Smith?
Neddy, I mean, in contrast to Roger, I think Neddy's path was sort of set fairly early, pretty much from his childhood. He never knew his father. It appears his dad was a US serviceman, because Ned's born late 1944, so at the end of the Second World War. Doesn't know his dad, unhappy childhood, goes to boys' homes, gets into trouble fairly early, the usual sort of stuff, maybe a bit of stealing or, reasonably minor stuff. So his path, if you like, as distinct from Roger's, was, to me, his trajectory was set from a very early age.
Okay.
And he goes on to commit a gang rape in 1967, and that's the first time he gets a significant lag. I think he gets 7 years for that, and after that, like a lot of them in those days who've come out of boys' homes, they've done this horrible crime, they meet a lot of people in jail. He sort of graduates into a whole range of other things. But the time I met Ned, I think it was the beginning of 87. It was just before he was charged with murder.
Yeah.
I was working at 60 Minutes, and the 60 Minutes reporter Mike Munro said, look, I reckon Ned Smith might have a story to tell us, something about a green light. Anyway, he says, I've arranged a lunch with Ned. So I went along with Mike Munro. I thought we'd go to, the Iron Duke Hotel in Alexandria and have a favourite one. Have a few schooners and a couple of pies or something. Oh, no. That's not Ned. Ned's, we're going to Prunia's in Wallara, which I think is now called Chiswick.
Oh,
this is fine dining. This is starched.
Been there once.
Starched. I've been there once too with Ned. Starched white tablecloths, old-fashioned waiters, blah blah blah. Anyway, Munro and I are sitting there. We've got the 60 Minutes expense card, the Amex, and it's going well. Ned was incredibly respectful. He was almost deferential in his manner. Very softly spoken, hulking sort of man. He seemed probably bigger than he was, or that's how I remember him.
Yeah.
And we're having a good lunch, and we're drinking a few Crown Lagers, and I can't remember what we're eating. But not long after Mike Munro and myself sit down at Prunia's with Ned, in walks a former New South Wales Detective Sergeant by the name of Murray Riley, who has recently got out of jail for attempting to smuggle in a whole pile of marijuana. Murray Riley knows Ned and comes over to our table, obviously sees Mike Munro from 60 Minutes. Introductions all round. Murray goes back to his table, which is full of youngish blokes all dressed in sort of like pastels, like it was Miami Vice, the old TV series.
You've
and
created a good picture there.
Loafers, no socks, So I think there's about 4 or 5 of them sitting at their table, and from time to time I sort of look around, and Murray Riley, who Ned called the Prince of Promises, he's sort of waving, and I noticed they're getting really stuck into the Veuve Clicquot champagne. Anyway, during lunch we say to Ned, "What do you do? How are you making a crust?" And he says, "Oh, I'm an invalid pensioner. I'm doing the best I can, etc." The usual. I go to get the bill with my 60 Minutes Amex. It's over $1,000.
Yeah.
I think it was 11 or 1,200. I can't remember. Munro and I go to Ned very respectfully and say, "Ned, we can't pay all this. Our boss will have a fit." And he sort of looks over at Riley's table, who are cacking themselves with laughter, and he reaches into his pocket, and I've never forgotten this. He pulls out this huge wad of $50 notes, like he's got a big hand, but it's just chock-a-block of 50s. Peels off about 500, 600, and says, "There you go." And we say, "Oh, thanks, Ned, really appreciate it." And then he drives off in a brand new Mercedes, and I'm saying to Munro, that's some pension he's got there, mate. But he was, look, that was the only time I met him, really. I spoke to him once or twice after that, but not, he was just, I suspect when he was, with certain people, he could be very respectful.
Yeah.
But we know that, he'd been convicted of a gang rape.
Yeah, when you got the nature of a crime like that, I think people can go, okay, respect a tough guy, a gangster, he does this, that's the code he lives by. But when you've crossed the line, when you're going into gang rape, it shows the type of person that you're dealing with. There's nothing, you can't dress that up.
He tried to in later years, and for the book, I eventually got hold of the transcript of that case, or at least the committal proceedings. And the victim had gone to the police the very next day with her mum. She was examined by a government medical officer. He gave evidence because Ned's solicitor was trying to suggest that, there was nothing untoward here. And the government medical officer said she had bruises all over her body, and she had been her arms were bruised. It was consistent with her being pinned down, and he had no doubt she'd been raped. So no matter how much Ned tried to dress it up, that she'd enjoyed it. It was a violent gang rape. Yeah. And the victim said, he was the ringleader. It never would have happened without Ned Smith.
And Roger and that we're going to talk about their relationship next, but that to me, and I'm thinking from a policeman's point of view, there's certain people that you associate with, and then there's certain natures of crime, and that one's got a big mark. Wouldn't trust him, don't like him, wouldn't do a thing for him. Commit a crime like that, and so that just shows to me, and this is just my thinking, how low Roger stoops to hang out with him and spend time with him and get involved in what they've done. When did they first meet? At what stage of their careers that should have been in opposite directions? But
they first meet in 1976.
Yep.
Ned Smith and a good mate of his, another armed robber called Bobby Chapman, have tried to do a robbery on a payroll that was heading towards Fielder's Bakery, a company, a bakery company, and the two blokes who were picking up the cash, because in those days everybody got paid in cash.
Yeah.
So the cash had to get from the bank to the office, whichever office that was. Ned and his mate Bobby Chapman try to rob it, fail, but shots are fired, one of which just very narrowly misses the bloke driving the car, lodges in the part of the car very close to his head, so he was almost killed. This is the first time that Roger catches up with Ned. It's not in the way it was portrayed in Blue Murder, but Ned Smith and Bobby Chapman are both arrested. They're charged, but Bobby Chapman is accused of firing the shots, and in later years Chapman says, Ned dobbed me in for that.
Yeah.
But it's at that stage that Roger starts to develop this relationship with Ned Smith, because he can see he's been in jail for a long time. He's mixing with various criminals, and he could be useful. So it's sort of, I guess it flourishes from there. But just to give you some idea of the way it sort of cut both ways, I mean, this guy Bobby Chapman was accused of firing the shots in that botched getaway. When it comes to trial, Roger gets in the box. And bear in mind, Roger has taken a statement, allegedly, from Bobby Chapman in which he says, I fired the shots, but it was an accident.
Unsigned.
Unsigned, yep. Funny about that, because Bobby Chapman is as hard as nails and wouldn't say boo to a goose. Anyway, there's this record of interview, Roger swears it's true, where Bobby Chapman says, I fired the shots, but it was accidental. Gets to trial, Roger jumps into the witness box and, much to the dismay and amazement of all, says, I've done further investigation. I've now found out that the shots weren't fired by Chapman. They were fired by a bloke called Robert McKinnon, who's an associate of Ned and Chapman. McKinnon has disappeared. And the Crown prosecutor is going, hang on, you've got a statement that you took from Bobby Chapman saying he fired, but it was an accident, and now you're telling me he did, which you swear is true. But on the other hand, you've now found this guy, Robert McKinnon, who fired the shots, and you're saying you got that information from an informant. Of course, Robert McKinnon can never be found. The trial is aborted, and Chapman, who's already in jail for something else, gets a much lesser sentence than he would have. It's a complete backflip, and it defies logic.
And that comes through in quite a few things, and we'll talk about one shortly where the consequences were someone, innocent person, ended up dead. But I've heard people talk about Roger, people that I respect, and said he was brilliant in the witness box. That charisma, he came across honesty, a brilliant memory, presented well to the jury, charmed people, that type of thing. But what front has he got to do that? I'm just, as you were telling that story, I'm sitting here thinking, how would you do that in the witness? Yeah, Neil, you confessed to me, but now I know it's not Neil, it was in fact John. Yeah. How do you know that? Oh, some informant told me it was John, but didn't Neil?
Yeah,
right.
That's right. As the Crown prosecutor said, this was outside court apparently, he said, you can't have it both ways. You can't swear that Chapman made the statement, the unsigned statement, in which he confesses to firing the shots, and now come in and tell us that it wasn't him. It was some other bloke who, conveniently for everyone, has disappeared off the face of the earth, never to be found. The front. I mean, he just he just seemed to, and I'm reading this transcript, he seems to be completely unfazed by any suggestion of inconsistency, wrongdoing. He's just, he's Roger. He's the prince of the city.
Above it. Now, it would be fair to interpret that change of evidence would it lend itself very nicely to receiving money to help someone get off?
I suspect so. Roger, in later years, said that Bobby Chapman was his informant. He also described him as the toughest man he'd ever met. I know that Chapman always denied being the informant. I spoke to somebody for the book, and that person said, well, there might be another explanation. Bobby was paying him.
Yeah.
And Bobby did have a fair amount of cash around that time. In his, I think it was in his wife's grandmother's safe. Maybe.
I laugh because it is a bygone era.
It is.
The laughing is not at the consequences that play out from this, but it just seems too ridiculous. We look back now and go, how the hell did that all happen?
Well, how could you get away with it? And even back then, in that instance of Bobby Chapman, and the Crown prosecutor took him outside. The trial's aborted, and the Crown prosecutor said, I don't believe there is an informant. He didn't believe it at the time, but there was nothing he could do. And it wasn't the first time that Roger changed his evidence. There were a couple of other instances where he arrests a heroin dealer. This is around 1982, 83. The guy is driving I think it was a purple Triumph Stag, and in the car they find like 8 bags of white powder, sets of scales, other bags. So it's consistent with somebody being I suppose, street-level heroin dealer. Roger arrests him, charges him, gets to court, and Roger gets in the witness box, having arrested this bloke, got to the stage of the trial and says, I've made further investigations again.
Yeah.
I believe that this person is innocent and that everything was planted in the car and on his person by his enemies, because he had enemies in the local business community. And again, this time it was a magistrate, I think. The magistrate's going, what? You've charged this guy. You've said, you've presented the evidence, and now you're telling me it's not true. He's a victim. And the guy gets off. I mean, Gary, you're right. I mean, the front, I don't know if it's confidence or hubris or ego, or whatever it was.
A combination of
all. Combination. But to actually sit there and be able to say that with a straight face and think you can carry it off, that tells you, I think, a lot about Roger.
I think it also says a little bit about the power of the police back in those days. Because you got the magistrates there, the people in the legal fraternity, they'd be sitting there, and the journalists as well. Everyone would know what was going on. You don't have to be Einstein to join the dots on those situations, but it was allowed to run. And
magistrates would have. Well, in this case, the magistrate blew up, and Roger had to go to the police headquarters and get some sort of formal documentation to drop the charges, because the magistrate wasn't.
Oh, that's right. The magistrate refused.
He refused, but you're right. In so many cases, and it goes back to the old verbals and the old load-ups. It was an accepted practice. They were very, very different times. It was accepted by some lawyers and some magistrates and judges, because it worked for so many years.
And I suppose it was allowed to a degree, and this is not saying it's right, it was allowed to a degree in that now in policing we've got so many tools to use when we're talking forensics, whether it be electronic, physical, surveillance, that type of thing. So it's easier to gather the facts and gather the evidence. Back in the day, well, if someone got murdered on the street, there's no CCTV footage, there's no phone records, there's no cameras there. So maybe it was okay, we're not happy with it, but we'll let the balance stay there in favour of the police.
I think there was that element that very much, and Rogerson argued this with me in an interview he did. I think we screened it on Four Corners, where he talked about that sort of culture, where he said there were 3 squads that did it: the consorting squad, armed hold-up, and the stick-ups. But he said it was just accepted, and it was done to people who were, quote, getting out of line. And as you've just explained, they didn't have listening devices, telephone intercepts, CCTV, all that stuff. And as far as Roger was concerned, this was actually, and it's been called this, no, I don't think Roger ever called anything corruption, but it's been described as noble cause corruption, where police would go, we know Neil's done it, he's getting out of hand, he's running around the streets with a gun, we're going to put him behind bars and we'll do it by hook or by crook.
Yeah.
And look, again, it's difficult to sometimes explain to people that that's how things were. And there was an element of, well, you know what? If Neil was running around with a shotgun in the street, good on him.
Yeah.
I know it's illegal and I know it shouldn't happen, but they're very different times and very different times for everybody. Journalism, policing, the law. I mean, it's still wrong.
I think it's important to make that, and it's more important to say it's still wrong. But I remember having a conversation with a particular detective where some, let's call it hard police work, was done, and the person was put away, and I've gone, you sure that's going to stand up in court? And if we lose it, we lose it, but what do you want? Let him run around and shoot innocent people?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, I wouldn't have charged the person. I didn't think there was enough evidence. And I had some respect for the person that had the ticker to charge this person, knowing that there's going to be criticism. And when I challenged the person on it, said, well, what do you want us to do? Let him run around shooting innocent people. And I thought, well, yeah, I understand that.
Yeah.
And noble cause corruption, that was really drummed into us. So I'm talking mid-'80s when I started in the police, and it was really drummed into us. So we're learning, and we were evolving. Obviously the Royal Commission in the New South Wales Police, turned things up on its head again. But it was different times. But in reading your book, and it gave me an appreciation of how you moved the moral compass slightly. Roger, if we're talking what you talked about there, was a drug dealer has got off for being punished in crime if a bribe was paid or whatever. There was another example in the book where someone actually, an innocent person, ended up dead because of that same type of behaviour. Can you talk us through that story?
Yeah, this is the what I call the saga of armed robber by the name of Philip Weston, who was a Kiwi. He robbed a bank in New Zealand. He did some time there. He comes over to Australia, and Weston robs a bank at the end of 1975. I think it's December 29, 1975. The armed hold-up squad is onto him and his three accomplices within 24 hours. They've obviously got a very good informant. And Weston is arrested in Bondi Junction, I think on January 1, 1976, at gunpoint by police. He goes for a gun. It's a violent struggle. They visit his flat where he's been living. There's Armalite rifles, there's handguns, there's false passports, there's false driver's licenses, wigs, etc., etc., the whole kit and caboodle that a serious crook needs. There's a number of detectives involved in the arrest of Philip Weston and his three co-accused. Roger's one of them. The key person here is Philip Weston. He applies for bail. It's initially refused. He applies for bail again, and armed hold-up detectives oppose it vigorously. If he gets out, he's going to do another armed robbery. Should not get out. Bail's refused, bail refused, bail refused. I think in total there's about 8 applications. He just keeps going and going and going. Roger gets involved, and all of a sudden the tone of what the armed hold-up squad is saying about Philip Weston changes quite dramatically. Oh, look, Philip's the black sheep of the family. I've met his mother, I've met his wife, they're both living in Manly. He's got 2 kids. They are people of the highest integrity. His mum needs Philip because, she's been ripped off by a couple of shysters. It's a sob story. The ground shifts dramatically. He doesn't get bail that day, but you can see the groundwork is being laid. And eventually, and I think through Rogerson and one other detective and they're both now dead, eventually Philip Weston appears at short notice and coincidentally or not, the detectives who have been opposing his bail vigorously, one of them's on annual leave. The other one, the day before, has gone off on a cruise round the South Pacific with his wife. Might be a coincidence, might be not.
And then a short bail application.
A bail application comes on
With
the next day.
Just breaking this down now, so the two key officers that were opposed to bail and had strong evidence, they happened to be away,
Yep.
and then a bail application is made at short notice.
Roger doesn't get in the box, but a very good mate of his gets in the box before a judge of the district court. And despite this guy being involved in the arrest, he says, I know nothing about Weston. I know nothing about his mum or anything like that, blah, blah, blah. Who can say if he'll answer bail? He probably will. I don't know if he was arrested at gunpoint. It's wishy-washy, completely. I know nothing.
As reading your book, I was thinking, well, what the hell are you doing in the witness box?
Well, that's what it later emerged. That's what the Crown prosecutors were saying. If you can't present the evidence, if you don't know the evidence, why are you in court? As it turned out, that detective knew exactly what sort of person Weston was. He failed to tell the Crown. He failed to tell the judge. Weston gets bail. And he, for a couple of weeks, for about a week, he reports, but then he stops reporting to Paddington Police Station. He's on the run. Very shortly after that, he's at Westfield Parramatta, Philip Weston, the armed robber. A bank officer notices him near the front door of the bank, trying to get in. He confronts Weston. There's a bit of a struggle. Weston runs away. The bank manager chases him. In those days, would you believe bank managers were given revolvers to stop armed robbers? I mean, the bank manager bravely chases Weston. Weston turns around and shoots him dead. There's an inquiry, but look, and Roger's questioned, but it doesn't go anywhere because it's the inquiry you're having when you're not having an inquiry.
Yeah.
There's no doubt now that I've looked at the transcript of that inquiry and spoken to people who were involved. There's no doubt in my mind that all that circumstantial evidence points to Roger Rogerson manipulating the system so that Philip Weston got bail. And there was a huge amount of money, $50,000, either paid or to be paid to Rogerson. And the result of that man getting bail, an innocent bank manager was murdered.
Yeah.
In broad daylight, in the middle of a Westfield shopping. He had two kids.
And if that's not enough to check yourself, if you were taking dollars on bribes to help people, and that's the consequences. Yeah, you're a sworn police officer and you're involved in that. So what happened to Weston?
Well, Weston's wanted for murder now. He's not just for jumping his bail. He's the suspect in the murder of this bank manager, 40-year-old bank manager, wife, two kids. He's been in the bank. It's his life.
Yeah.
Or it was. Weston's on the run. Roger pretty much takes control of the hunt for Philip Weston. He's a key planner in the whole thing. Weston is finally located north of Sydney, Avoca, about 80, 90 k's north of Sydney, I think, in a little shack on a beach. The armed hold-up squad and was it the special? It wasn't special weapons in those days, but it was. It was the equivalent. They're all armed with bulletproof vests and shotguns. They surround Philip Weston early one morning. Tear gas goes into the little beach shack where Weston is. He's got a gun. Shots are fired from inside. He sticks his head through a bathroom window to be confronted by three officers, all with shotguns. They fear they're going to be shot, so they open fire. Philip Weston is shot dead. And I don't think, on the documentation that I've seen, I don't think there is anything, I'm not sure if untoward is the right word, but I don't think there's anything suspicious about the actual death of Weston. It's what preceded that, how he got bail. But, with Weston's death, conveniently for Roger,
trail's left.
Trail is dead.
Yeah.
The trail is caught. There's no allegation that can be proved.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things was that I found in some of the documents, Gary, was that if Weston had been taken alive, the person who was going to drive him back to Sydney was Rogerson. Well, obviously with a couple of other police.
Yeah.
But you sort of look at that and you go, wow, he sort of had all bases covered.
Yeah, and I'm looking at an operation of that nature and the complexity of it and all that. And if doing corruptly what he had done, he's juggling so many different things.
It's extraordinary, really. I mean, but such was his standing that he
didn't get questioned.
He didn't get questioned.
So that was the end of Weston.
That was the end of Weston. There was an inquiry run by somebody from the Public Service Board.
Yep.
And Roger was called, and that's where a lot of this evidence came out. But it just never went anywhere. And there was some allegations of wrongdoing, never went anywhere.
Yeah.
It was just, they were in a tiny little paper one day, forgotten the next. Roger sailed on.
Without mentioning names, you've spoken to police that were very angry about what happened in that situation too.
Yeah.
Like the people that, saw it for what it was and no action taken.
I spoke to, and this is in very recent years, or in fact last year, one of the armed hold-up squad members who had vigorously opposed Philip Weston's bail is still with us. And I wrote him a letter and I said, do you remember anything about this case? And he phoned me about a week later and he said, yeah, I do remember it. He said, men died because of what Roger did.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk over the phone. Come and see me. And this guy's in his mid.
Still old school.
Still old school.
Paranoia never loses.
I don't talk over the phone. I'm thinking, okay. I go to see him and he says, I've got no doubt Rogerson was paid. The word was he was paid 50 grand or was going to be paid 50 grand. That's why Weston was trying to rob the bank.
Yeah.
He was a good mate of Roger's at one point. And very shortly after Weston was shot at Avoca and he comes back from his Russian cruise liner trip around the South Pacific, he's unceremoniously kicked out of the armed hold-up squad.
That's how he was treated.
That's how he was treated, because Roger knew that he was no longer...
Couldn't be trusted.
Couldn't be trusted, I guess.
That would be it.
That would be it. And even though they'd been mates, they'd shared a car to work, their families knew each other, no, that was it. He was out. And it was pretty much, I wouldn't say the end of his police career, but it never really recovered.
Soul destroying, I'd say, in that if you're fighting against the culture and the organisation that you're trying to protect doesn't support you, and you just get flicked. And I can imagine what he was going through. The thing that really came out to me on it, Neil, and this is, I feel like I'm naive because I know about the crimes you're talking about and different things, but when they've done something like that, I would think if they got away with what played out there, that would be the end of it. Surely a half-decent human being would say, enough is enough, we've lost our way. Someone with a moral compass must put their hand up and go, stuff this, we're going down the wrong path. But it didn't, did it?
It never happened. And I think Philip Weston, the bloke who gets shot up at Avoca, was portrayed as a madman, mad dog.
Yeah.
And the newspapers of the day, and fair enough, they're getting the information from the police. Don't approach him, don't go near him. He's going to, and Rogerson, or one of Rogerson's closest colleagues, puts in this report saying he will shoot it out with police. He hates the armed hold-up squad. He will take every officer with him. So don't approach him, whatever you do. Leave it to us.
So it's almost setting up the public to be ready that
Correct.
When he was arrested, he was shot and killed and the police won the gunfight.
They won the gunfight. Don't get me wrong. I mean, Philip Weston had done a very bad thing, obviously, but he wouldn't have been out on bail, in my opinion, and given the material that I've uncovered over the last few years, he would not have been out on bail if not for Roger.
And that bank manager would still be alive.
He'd still be alive, yeah.
I know, that's the consequences of it. Can I, I said it was going to be a heavy conversation. We go into a murky world, but we'll push through. The shooting of Lawrence Byrne.
Lawrence Byrne was shot in 1978.
Who by?
No prizes for guessing here, Gary. He's shot by Roger Rogerson. Lawrence Butchy Byrne, his nickname was Butchy. He's an armed robber.
Yep.
He's got a record. Roger, in fact, tells me many, many years ago that he'd arrested Butchy a couple of times. He'd done armed robberies. But the armed hold-up squad has a tip-off at least 2 or 3 weeks before that. Butchy is going to rob the takings of South Sydney Juniors on a Sunday, because every Sunday the club takings from the previous Friday, Saturday and so on are taken in an old combi with maybe 1 or 2 old blokes as security and deposited in a night safe in a bank in Anzac Parade. So we're talking about, Anzac Parade, Randwick, Kingsford, pretty much sort of middle, as not the CBD, but
just on the outskirts.
It's just on the outskirts. And they observed Butchy Byrne 1 week. He's clearly surveilling the old combi as it comes towards the bank, but that's all he's doing. And they know it's Butchy because Butchy is actually in jail at this time, but he's doing day release. So on the Saturday before Butchy is shot, he's in jail. Somebody phones the jail and says, we need Butchy for an urgent painting job, because he had been working on day release for a painting and decorating company. And the jail goes, oh, okay. So Butchy walks out the door that Sunday morning, meets up with 2 mates, and they go to rob the takings of South Sydney Juniors. The old combi turns up, same time, same place, same station every week, so predictable. Butchy's there with his 2 co-accused, but so is the armed hold-up squad. And Roger has got a bulletproof vest. He's got his shotgun, a Remington shotgun, which apparently has some very powerful shot, not just your normal pellets. There are many, many police there in cars. Roger says, I saw Butchy Byrne starting to point his shotgun in my direction. I opened fire. Roger fires 4 blasts from his shotgun. His colleague, the late Arnie Tees, fires at least 4 shots from his service revolver. Some of them go through the windscreens. Some of them go into the tyres. Car takes off down Anzac Parade. This is 10:30 on a Sunday morning, middle of February. Car takes off. Other police who are there in the stakeout start opening fire. One officer empties 6 shots from his Smith & Wesson. A police car gives chase. An officer leans out of the car, firing his shotgun at the escaping crims, who are apparently firing back through the back window, which is now shattered. The car's riddled with bullets. It gets about a few hundred metres down Anzac Parade and comes to a stop. Tyres shot out. Butchy has been mortally wounded. The 2 other guys in the car, incredibly, one of them has a sort of a slight wound. Yeah, but they're still alive. Nobody quite knows how, because as Roger described this to me in later years. I think he said this at one of his shows that he did. He said that car was full of more holes than your mother's colander, and Butchy fell out of the car dead onto the road. Well, not quite as Roger described it in later years, but Butchy did fall out of the car. He died 6 days later in hospital, and at the very, very short inquest that followed, that as far as I can make out barely got reported, Butchy was shot either by Roger's shotgun or the other bloke who was firing the shotgun, but Roger took the credit. So it was, we'll wait for him. We know he's coming out of jail. We know he's going to do the job. We'll just wait. And there were people on the footpath. There were the couple of old blokes in the combi who were taking the money. And all of a sudden there's a gunfight in the middle of Anzac Parade in Sydney. At least 20 shots were fired, and I think that's probably an underestimate.
Yeah, and look, planning operations like that, there's certain times, and it always improves, and it's tightened up. But that's it's messy in the regards, and unless you're there, I suppose I can't really comment. But it's amazing that another shooting that Rogers had dealings with the deceased person.
Yeah, that's right. He knew him. As he said himself, he told me he knew Butchy. People knew who Butchy was. And look, if Butchy was pointing his shotgun at Roger and maybe the blokes in the combi van,
no problems.
There's no problems.
Yep.
And shots were definitely fired. So I'm not saying that this maybe falls into the worst category. I guess it goes to policing in those days where that's how things were done.
Yeah.
The robbers were on their way. There's no listening devices for the car. You can't listen to their mobile phones. You've got to let it unfold.
Well, from tactical policing, it got to, because there was a couple of other police shootings, and we brought in a policy of contain and negotiate, and that was in place at the Lint Cafe, but then different things for, if it's a terrorist situation, because you've got to evolve and adapt. But, I look at the latter part of my career, look at the early part of my career. At the early part of my career, I remember sitting in banks or outside banks with guns waiting for someone to come and rob it and arrest them, and it wasn't you didn't need to get signed off by senior police officers. It was basically the detective's office. What are you doing? Oh, this bloke's going to go rob a bank. We're going to wait for him and catch him there. Yeah. That was the way things were done. But I think they need to tighten up the jail security. If I'm not wrong, it was a phone call from a company that was no longer in existence.
It was a phone call from a company that I think had gone into, liquidation or whatever. It was a very small company, which was run by a guy who had met Butchy in jail, so he had a criminal record himself. And he was interviewed and he said, I never phoned the jail. Yeah. I hadn't employed Butchy for like 6 months. I never phoned anybody. So somebody has phoned the jail, someone, and said, we need Butchy. Maybe it was one of his co-accused, but they just let him out.
Not a lot of checks and balances.
No, there weren't.
Now we'll have a break in a sec, but you just talked about Anzac Parade, 10:30 on a Sunday morning, and 40 or so shots, burn, car chases. Can you imagine that happening today? The attention, it's almost like it's something that, thankfully, it doesn't happen, but it's almost like something that's.
It's a bygone era, and that's the way things were done. There were shotguns in the back of police cars. Yeah. People took off. An armed robbery was about to happen, as you say, although in Butchy's case they had like a couple of weeks warning. So, look, maybe things could have been done differently. That's not my area. All I can do is say, here's what we know from the coronial inquest, and these are the statements of the police themselves. But look, there was no criticism of Rogerson. There was no criticism of anybody. Butchy had pulled a gun or his shotgun, and another bloke who also had a gun had fired back. But it wouldn't happen now. It wouldn't happen.
No, well, it was a sign of the times, wasn't it? The police were, untouchable in terms of the view of the public. The police are just doing their job. The bad guys would be arguing against it, but the general public and the way the media reported it, that whatever the police did, it was for the good of society. So it was never a question.
That's right. And in those days, you had crime reporters who had a very good relationship with detectives in particular.
I think you could say embedded.
Almost. But, with homicide, because crime, well, like now, sold newspapers in those days, particularly tabloids. And there was nothing wrong with that. But reporters were very close to detectives like Rogerson, not necessarily, a whole range of detectives. Yeah. And they are not going to be critical. And there wasn't that investigative side happening back in the 70s.
No.
I think the first time it really came into being was probably with Lanfranchi. It started a bit.
That started the question.
Started people questioning, hang on, there's something seriously wrong here.
Something
either with the methods or the end result or the end, what's happened.
Something smelly there. We'll get onto that in part two. But just before, in case people aren't, after they just hear this, we talk about, and I feel the need to defend police too, because we talk about corrupt small portion. I know people, I know detectives that worked in those squads in those times, and I've got nothing but utmost respect for them. And a rotten apple like Roger and others, bring our reputation down. And I know I'll sit here and say from a former detective, I despise people like that have tarnished the reputation of the hard-working detectives.
Yeah, look, I agree with you absolutely, because I know some of those people from the old armed hold-up squad and other squads, and in my view, they were really, really good detectives.
Yeah.
And it's what you alluded to earlier. They worked with Roger. I don't think a lot of them knew exactly what he was doing. I think he manipulated his colleagues, some of them, not all of them,
Yep.
but they didn't know what he was doing or planning, or, so I think a lot of them were unfairly tarnished by Roger, and I would like to make that point too, that I think there are a lot of good detectives. Everybody goes, they were all corrupt, they were all rotten, it was a shocking era. Well, no, it's not that simple. There were good detectives there, and Roger, well, boy, did he tarnish a few reputations, to say the least.
That's probably a good way to end part one. We'll be back shortly with part two. Thanks, Neil.